The victim's father suddenly appeared, shot Doucette while news cameras were rolling.
When a child loses their life to murder, something inside a parent breaks forever. Most parents grieve in silence, but some don't wait for justice to come and take matters in their own hands.
An outraged father is lashing out at the man who brutally murdered his son.
These are the rare moments caught on camera when grief turns to fury.
Madison was indicted on 14 counts, including 6 counts of aggravated murder.
And devastated parents take revenge before the law ever can, starting with a father's brave revenge caught on camera. Jeffrey Doucette. On March 16, 1984, Baton Rouge Airport became the scene of one of the most shocking moments ever caught on live television. As police escorted 25-year-old Jeffrey Doucette through the terminal for his hearing, a single gunshot rang out. The bullet struck Doucette in the head, him instantly. Standing nearby was a grieving father, Gary Plochet. The incident was broadcast live.
The victim's father suddenly appeared, shot Doucette while news cameras were rolling,
leaving viewers stunned by what they had just witnessed. Jeffrey Doucette had been a familiar face in Baton Rouge. He was known as a patient and friendly karate instructor and taught local children, including Gary's 11-year-old son, Jody Plochet. But behind that reputation, Doucette had been grooming Jody for months, spending extra time with him, isolating him from family, and earning his trust. That manipulation culminated in February 1984, when Doucette kidnapped Jody from his home and drove across several states to a motel in Anaheim, California. For a week, Doucette held Jody captive, repeatedly assaulting him and convincing him that his parents no longer loved him. After days of investigation, the FBI traced phone calls made by Doucette. Those calls led agents to a motel near Disneyland, where they found Doucette and Jody. Doucette was arrested without resistance, and Jody was safely returned home. When news of the abuse reached Baton Rouge, no one was more devastated than Gary Plochet. He had trusted Doucette completely, allowing him into his home and his son's life. So when he learned that Doucette would be flown back to Louisiana, Gary decided to confront him. Waiting at the airport with a small revolver in his pocket, he stood by a public payphone as police escorted Doucette. As Doucette passed within a few feet, Gary drew his weapon and fired once, ending Doucette's life instantly. Gary was arrested immediately and charged with second-degree murder, but the case would divide the country. The defense argued that Gary acted under temporary insanity, driven by shock and trauma. Thankfully, the court showed mercy at the end. Gary pleaded guilty to manslaughter, received a suspended sentence, and never served time in prison. There was an overwhelming public sympathy for him. Thousands had written letters of support, and even some jurors admitted they wouldn't possibly have convicted him. But Doucette's death wasn't the last time grief turned a courtroom into chaos. Decades later in Ohio, another father would lose control when faced with the man who took his daughter's life. Michael Madison. In July 2013, East Cleveland police were called to a small, rundown garage after neighbors complained of a foul stench filling the air. What they found inside would uncover one of the most horrifying murder cases in modern Ohio history.
The man accused of killing 3 women and leaving their bodies in East Cleveland faced a judge this morning.
Stuffed inside multiple black garbage bags was the decomposing body of a woman. Within 48 hours, 2 more bodies were found nearby. All 3 victims were women. All 3 had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and discarded like trash. The killer's name was Michael Madison, a 35-year-old registered sex offender who lived just a few houses away from where the bodies were found. The victims, Shatisha Sheely, 28, Angela Deskins, 38, and Sherelda Terry, 18, had all vanished from the same rough stretch of Hayden Avenue. Each had been lured, attacked, and killed in almost the same way. Madison wrapped their bodies in several layers of plastic bags and tape, folding them tightly before hiding them in abandoned properties around his neighborhood. During questioning, Madison admitted to killing one of the women, but claimed he couldn't remember the others. The trial began in 2016, but no one could have expected what was about to happen in court. The courtroom atmosphere was explosive. The prosecution described Madison as a predator who hunted and discarded women he saw as worthless. They detailed how each killing was premeditated and cruelly executed. The defense tried to argue that Madison's abusive upbringing and mental health issues made him incapable of full responsibility. Then came one of the most unforgettable moments in true crime history. During the sentencing phase, Van Terry, the father of 18-year-old victim Sherelda Terry, took the stand to deliver his impact statement. He began calmly, but as he locked eyes with Madison, rage took over. Terry lunged across the courtroom and tried to attack Madison, shouting that he would never forgive him for what he'd done to his daughter. Court officers restrained him instantly, but the emotional eruption echoed through the room. After the incident, deputies immediately restrained and removed him from the courtroom, but he wasn't charged with assault or contempt. The judge and court officials recognized that it was an emotional reaction rather than a deliberate act of violence. Prosecutors later confirmed they would not pursue any charges, acknowledging the unimaginable pain Terry was under after hearing the details of his daughter Sherelda's murder. Madison was sentenced to death in May 2016. 4 years later, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld the verdict, rejecting all appeals. Today, he sits on death row, showing little remorse. But if this case showed how pain can erupt inside a courtroom, what happened next revealed just how deep that anger is when the victim is a 3-year-old child. Jason Stevens. In June 1997, Jacksonville police were called to a quiet home after reports of a violent break-in. Inside, they found the scene of a struggle and a missing child. 3-year-old Robert Sparrow was gone. Witnesses said a man had forced his way in, robbed the house, and fled with the child in his arms. That man was Jason Demetrius Stevens, a 23-year-old career criminal who had turned an ordinary robbery into a nightmare. For days, Jacksonville was gripped by panic. The search for little Robert covered neighborhoods, fields, and drainage canals. The child's body was discovered not far from the house. He'd been killed within hours of the kidnapping. Stevens had tried to hide what he'd done, but investigators quickly pieced together the evidence. He was charged with first-degree murder, but that wasn't enough for Robert's grieving father. And what he did next would shock the world. During the early hearings, the Sparrow family sat only a few feet away from their son's murderer. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. That thread finally snapped one morning during a hearing. Robert's father had been asked to speak, to tell the court what it felt like to lose his son. Standing only a few feet from Jason, he began calmly at first, describing Robert's laughter, his favorite toy, the small gap in his teeth. But when he looked over and saw Jason sitting there, smirking faintly, everything broke. In a blur, he lunged across the table. The impact sent papers flying, and officers rushed in as he wrapped his hands around Jason's throat, shouting through tears that his son's face still haunted him. The courtroom erupted into chaos. It took 3 deputies to pull him off. Jason was hustled out as the father sank to his knees. No charges were pressed. Everyone in that room, even the judge, knew this wasn't an attack from hatred, but heartbreak. The father was escorted out and banned from attending the rest of the proceedings, but nobody blamed him. Most people said they would have done the same. When the trial ended, the result was no surprise. Jason was found guilty and sentenced to death, plus life sentences for the rest of his crimes. He's still sitting on Florida's death row today, waiting for an execution date that never seems to come. The Sparrow family's heartbreak echoed across Florida, but up in Massachusetts, a devastated father would soon make headlines for the same reason: Jose Santiago. It was March 2012 in Springfield, Massachusetts, when police responded to a domestic disturbance call that quickly turned into a homicide scene. Inside an apartment on Federal Street, officers found 25-year-old Jessica Rojas bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds. She was rushed to Bay State Medical Center, but died shortly after arriving. The suspect was her boyfriend, Jose Santiago, a man she had been seeing for about a year. Investigators later learned that the two had a volatile relationship, with arguments that had been escalating for months. On that morning, neighbors heard shouting and something breaking, then a sudden quiet. Police tracked Santiago down later that same day in a parking garage near a hospital, sitting quietly inside his car. He didn't resist when officers moved in. The weapon was recovered, and Santiago was taken into custody, charged with first-degree murder, and held without bail. But what happened inside that courtroom would become one of the most unforgettable moments in the entire case. As Santiago was led into court in handcuffs, Jessica's father, Edwin Rojas, snapped. The moment he saw Santiago, He lunged across the courtroom railing, shouting his daughter's name and trying to get to him. Another man who was a family friend also joined the attack. Court officers swarmed instantly, wrestling both men to the floor as chaos broke out. One officer was struck during the scuffle, and several benches were knocked over before order was restored. Santiago was quickly escorted out, unharmed but visibly shaken, while Jessica's father was dragged away in tears. Outside the courthouse, Jessica's father didn't apologize. He stated that no parent should have to sit quietly in front of the person who killed their child. The police charged him with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest, while the other man faced assault and battery on a public employee. But prosecutors didn't push hard on the charges. Both men were released soon after, and neither served jail time. Santiago was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Jose Santiago remains behind bars today. His name barely appears in the news anymore, but the memory of that courtroom outburst still defines the case. Just a few years later, a courtroom in Washington would see almost the same scene. Another father crosses the line to avenge his child's murder. Ryan Burge. It was November 2nd, 2018, when 5-year-old Hartley Anderson was left in the care of her mother's boyfriend, Ryan Mason Burge, at their home in Battleground, Washington. Her mother had gone to work that morning, trusting Burge to look after her daughter. By the end of the day, Hartley would be dead, and Burge would be the one responsible. According to investigators, Burge had been seen with Hartley earlier that afternoon at a grocery store. Security footage showed her walking beside him, quiet but unharmed. Nothing seemed wrong. But a few hours later, emergency responders were called to the house. Hartley was unconscious, covered in bruises, and bleeding internally. When the medical report came back, the truth was undeniable. Hartley's death had been violent. Her body showed signs of repeated blows, some inflicted hours before she died. The state charged Burge with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. Then came the first court appearance. Burge stood in the courtroom, shackled and silent. Sitting just a few feet away was Peter Anderson, Hartley's biological father, who had barely spoken since the day his daughter was killed. When Burge's charges were read aloud, something inside him broke. Without warning, Anderson lunged forward and vaulted over the courtroom barrier, shouting his daughter's name, trying to reach Burge. Security officers rushed to stop him, but not before he got close enough to make contact. The moment was over in seconds, but it was unforgettable. Anderson was pulled to his feet and escorted out in handcuffs, still crying. Reporters later described his face as pure devastation. The judge didn't press charges for assault. No one wanted to see another life destroyed. The outburst was ruled an emotional reaction. The father wasn't allowed back into the courtroom for the remainder of the trial. The case continued over the next 2 years, and when it finally reached sentencing in May 2020, the evidence against Burge was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty on all counts. The judge called his actions brutal, senseless, and unforgivable, before sentencing him to 40 years in prison. After the sentencing, Hartley's family issued a short statement, one line that summed up everything they'd lost. "There is no justice that brings our daughter back." Today, Ryan Burge is serving his sentence in a Washington state correctional facility. He'll probably pass away before he ever sees daylight again. While Hartley's case was soaked in tragedy, the next one from San Antonio began as something small, a petty argument that spiraled into murder, and then an unforgettable courtroom brawl. Victor Rivas. It started as a small argument between teenagers in San Antonio, but by the evening of May 16, 2022, that argument had turned into a murder. Victor Nathaniel Rivas, then just 17, shot and killed Ethan Soto, a 15-year-old boy from the West Side. The police later called this incident an ambush over stolen vape cartridges. Yes, a murder over vapes. According to investigators, Rivas had been trying to get back his stolen vape cartridges back from Ethan. Ethan's mother even tried to defuse the situation by offering to pay, but Rivas wasn't interested in apologies or repayment. Later that same day, Rivas pulled up, got out, and shot Ethan several times before running off. Police tracked Rivas down within days. He was found hiding out nearby, still in possession of the gun used in the shooting. He was arrested and charged with murder, later transferred to adult court because of the severity of the crime. But what happened next in court was unimaginable. In October 2023, Rivas Rivas was brought into a Bexar County courtroom for a preliminary hearing. The atmosphere was tense from the start. Ethan's family sat in the gallery. When Rivas entered in his jail uniform, one relative whispered that he had smirked. Others said he flashed a middle finger toward the family. Whatever it was enough to set off the spark. In an instant, several members of Ethan's family leapt over the courtroom railing. They charged straight toward Rivas, fists flying. Deputies barely had time to react. The first man to reach him landed a punch to the side of Rivas's face before bailiffs wrestled him away. Another relative jumped in next, and it turned into a whole brawl. The judge hit the panic button and ducked out through a side door as the courtroom erupted into chaos. Rivas was dragged to safety. His face was bloodied but not seriously hurt. When things finally calmed down, 4 relatives of Ethan were arrested, 2 adults and 2 juveniles. They were charged with assault and interfering with court proceedings, though the charges were mostly misdemeanors. The courtroom was cleared that day, and the rest of the hearing was postponed. In the end, the case didn't go to trial. In 2025, Victor Rivas accepted a plea deal, 40 years in prison for murder, plus another 10 years for evading arrest. When the sentencing came down, Ethan's mother spoke in court. She said no number of years could balance what was taken from her, but at least she didn't have to see Rivas's face anymore. Today, Rivas sits in a Texas state prison, serving a sentence that'll keep him behind bars for most of his life. While this murder started over a petty argument over vapes, the next case was one of the highest-profile sexual assault cases in American history, and the dad's courtroom attack would shock the world. Larry Nassar. For decades, Larry Nassar had been one of the most trusted names in American athletics. He was the team doctor for USA Gymnastics, but behind that carefully built image, he was a predator. Under the cover of medical treatment, Nassar assaulted hundreds of girls and young women, many of them Olympic athletes, including Simone Biles. Nassar's arrest in 2016 opened the floodgates. He was charged in both state and federal courts in Michigan for multiple counts of criminal conduct, having CP on his computer and tens of thousands of illegal images on his computers. He received a 60-year sentence. The judge famously told him, "I just signed your death warrant."
I just signed your death warrant.
That day, more than 150 women and girls stood in court to confront the man who had assaulted them, but no one could have predicted what was going to happen next. Among those sitting in the crowd was Randall Margraves, the father of 3 daughters who had all been assaulted by Nassar. When his turn came to speak, he stepped forward, visibly shaking. He looked at Nassar and asked the judge for 5 minutes alone in a locked room with this demon. The courtroom went still. When the judge gently refused, Margraves repeated himself. "Just 1 minute?" Again, she said no. And then he snapped. Without another word, he lunged across the courtroom and charged toward Nassar, shouting, "Let me at him!" He was tackled to the ground before he could reach Larry. The entire scene lasted less than 10 seconds, but felt like a lifetime. Outside, reporters swarmed him later, but he didn't justify what he'd done. He simply said, "I'm a father. You can't understand unless you've been there." He was briefly detained and charged with contempt of court, but the judge refused to punish him, saying she understood his pain even if the courtroom couldn't condone violence. That moment became one of the most unforgettable images from the entire Larry Nassar case. As for Larry, he will never leave prison. He's serving multiple life sentences stacked one after another. In 2023, he was stabbed multiple times in prison by another inmate. All of these cases so far showed fathers taking revenge, but our next case involved a mother who took matters into her own hands. Marianne Bachmeier. On the morning of March 6, 1981, a small courtroom in West Germany was filled with reporters and lawyers waiting for testimony in the trial of Klaus Grabowski. He was accused of killing a 7-year-old girl named Anna Bachmeier. Sitting just a few meters away from him was Anna's mother, Marianne Bachmeier, her face calm, her hands resting on her handbag. Nobody knew that inside that handbag was a loaded .22 caliber Beretta pistol, and that within minutes she would make history as the woman who brought her own form of justice into a courtroom. To understand that moment, you have to know what had already been taken from her. A year earlier, in May 1980, Marianne's daughter had disappeared after leaving for school. When police found her body stuffed inside a box near a canal, the entire country recoiled in horror. The man responsible was Grabowski, a 35-year-old neighbor and convicted child molester who had already undergone chemical castration. He had later taken hormone therapy to reverse it. He had a long history of abuse abusing young girls, but he'd been released and supposedly rehabilitated. Anna's murder exposed how wrong that assumption had been. The details of the crime were unbearable. Grabowski had lured Anna to his home, assaulted her, and strangled her with a pair of his fiancé's tights before hiding her body. It was the kind of story that burns itself into the mind of a parent. Marianne was shattered. In the months leading up to the trial, she rarely appeared in public. On the third day of the trial, Grabowski began testifying again, this time talking about how he had only committed murder because he feared losing his fiancée. Something inside Marianne snapped. She stood up, reached into her bag, and pulled out the Beretta. In front of the judge, lawyers, and journalists, she raised the gun and fired 8 shots. 6 of them hit Grabowski. He died instantly. Witnesses said she spoke only a few words as she fired. "This is for you, Anna." A mother had just killed her child's murderer right in the courtroom. The story dominated European headlines for weeks. Marianne's trial was held 2 years later in 1983. She was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter and illegal possession of a firearm, and sentenced to 6 years in prison. She served just over 3 and was released early for good behavior. After her release, she tried to rebuild her life away from the spotlight. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the 1990s, she allowed a German TV crew to film her final months. She said she wanted people to understand that vengeance doesn't heal anything, even if it feels like justice in the moment. Marianne Bachmeier died in 1996 at the age of 46. Do you believe these courtroom attacks are justified, or should justice have been left to the courts? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. And before you leave, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Criminal Corner so you don't miss the next ones.